Furniture is something that, perhaps next to clothing, or maybe arguably jewelry, is something that surrounds us on a daily basis. It has this amazing role as a functional object that carries meaning. And that meaning is usually not only accessible to people, but the meaning is usually created by the people who use the furniture, and it comes through associations. You know, I mean, the cliche might be grandma's rocking chair, right? I mean, we all love those things because it was grandma's rocking chair. So for me, what that's meant is that it has to be around long enough for that to happen, and it has to be accessible, and it has to be inviting. It's that durability that leads to use, which leads to building associations, which leads to meaning and leads to value. Well, I was born in Providence and went to school in Providence, and lived in Cranston and Summern and Matunic at Carpenter's Beach. I remember when I was about 10 years old on that little black and white TV set seeing the John F. Kennedy inauguration. And I remember seeing Robert Frost. And while my parents had always been interested in poetry, and I had heard it, and they were it was a very supportive family. This was the first time, like many people, I'd ever seen a poet. And to me it was just an amazing experience. And I thought from that time, wow, that'd be a cool thing to do. And so I became very interested in writing and poetry and in doing something creative. And when I got to college, I had the benefit of some really interesting teachers. When we would study a certain period in literature, often we would go to houses or places where we would experience the broader material culture that the literature was connected to. And I remember so clearly being much more fascinated by the furniture and the objects and the pots and pans and the architecture than I was even about the writing. I became gradually very interested in objects and furniture in particular. And so I began making things. And while I was still an undergraduate, I opened my first little studio and started teaching myself how to make things, and make furniture in particular. That was way before I actually got training and went back to graduate school to study furniture design. I did that at RISD. Rhode Island was a perfect place to live and to make my work. The places where I need to get were very accessible. It seemed the perfect place to live as an artist. Rhode Island is a great and supportive community for making art. At that time, I'd known Tay Frid, who I'd met a few years earlier, who was running an MFA program in furniture design at RISD. And he was a very supportive and helpful person in my life. He encouraged me to come and seek advice from him anytime, which I did over a period of 2 or 3 years, before I then decided it was time to go back to graduate school. I could see that I needed that. I had no design training up to that point, so I went to RISD, to the graduate program. And I taught then briefly in industrial design. I taught in interior architecture for a few years part-time. And now I teach there full-time since we formed the department. And currently, the department head, I've been at RISD now for over 30 years. In the studio, I make one-of-a-kind things that I design and build. And there's work that's done on commission basis, work that's directly for clients. There's a level of investigation there that is this very rich way of letting the design develop as you tinker with it and make it, and really the thinking about it and the making are never separate, and they develop together. learning through this kind of haptic experience, where you combine theory and skill and thinking and making, and those kinds of things have all become one big body of work for me. I would say that from the outset with a speculative or a one-off piece that you can invest a certain amount of skill and expertise in the piece that is not easily reproducible, where it's your hand, it's the kind of thing that the piece is dependent on your hand being involved in it. But when you're designing something for production, it has to be designed so that it's simpler and can be made by many other hands in a simpler way. I sketch and I model. I like to mock it up as close to full scale as I can, or at full scale very early in the process. I'll take some inexpensive wood that's hanging around and rough it out on the bandsaw and shape it to the extent that I need to in order to understand some issues. Test those things out in real scale. Then I often make another drawing. Then I'll make the real object. And oddly enough, then I often make a final drawing after the piece is done. And that drawing will serve to help me to do it again later if I want to. I'm very excited about what I'm doing now. And my work these days is much simpler. I try very hard to create things that are as direct as I can possibly make them, and they don't necessarily need some of the frills maybe that I had on some of my older pieces. Furniture design, in the way that I'm interested in furniture design, learning how to do it well, learning how to handle materials well, for me is important. So I've invested years in my life of learning to do that pretty well. I feel like there's a long way to go. I've got a lot to learn. I'm eager to keep pushing this. And it's a challenge. In fact, it's a challenge when you have a few decades of working in a certain way. And when you have people who know about your work who expect a certain thing, it's an interesting challenge to keep growing and developing and doing new things. I'm very much interested in and motivated by practical solutions to things. Like, for example, getting up on the wrong side of the bed. And so I'm designing another bed, and I'm very excited about it because it's a bed with two right sides so that you can always get up on the right side of the bed.